Hey there, welcome to the Event Manager Podcast. I'm Miguel Neves, the Editor-in-Chief of Skift Meetings. Today, or this episode, is something a little bit different. We have no special invited guest. It is just me, so hopefully you will enjoy it. But it is a special episode around event tech and the state of event tech. And it's really around my visit to the Event Tech Live trade show that happened in London this week, and my impressions of the show, and kind of thinking outside the box about what that means. Who was there? What did we talk about in the aisles? What is the state of event tech? Who's investing in what? What are those conversations? And who's paying attention? Because I think event tech has gone through that crazy ride of the pandemic, of being virtual events being the only thing that we're able to do. Now that we're able to do in-person events, where does that leave the industry? And so I've tried to have these conversations and kind of distill them into a short podcast for you to listen to and hopefully get an impression of what's happening with event tech at the moment. So I hope you enjoy that. I hope you check out the other episodes of the Event Manager podcast. So without further ado, this is the event tech episode of the Event Manager podcast. Hi everybody, Miguel Neves, Editor-in-Chief here. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about event tech. And the reason for this is that I've just come back from Event Tech Live, a show that takes place in London and is fully dedicated to event tech. I think it is, to my knowledge, the only show, at least in Europe, that is fully dedicated to event technology. And so it's a really interesting opportunity to just understand where we are and understand the state of event tech right now. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed. I think that event tech has gone through definitely a crazy bubble in 2020 and 21. And of course, we saw those amazing amounts of funding coming into the industry. Hopin valued at close to $8 billion and receiving over $1 billion in funding. Crazy amounts, and a number of IPOs as well, including Cvent, who re-IPO'd. Lots of interesting things happening over the last 2.5 years. But now, just like in-person events, it feels like event tech is kind of coming back to where it was in many ways. And of course, it feels a little deflated. And that's unavoidable, I think. I think that's just the nature if you go through such a crazy bubble and then you come back to sort of where you were before that. I think it's quite hard to really feel successful or feel really happy about it. But nevertheless, I think that event tech is alive and kicking. And I asked a number of founders, a number of representatives of the brands on site, if I was accurate in saying that revenue for them was around double what it was in 2019. And quite a few agreed. I didn't have anybody to say that was way off. And some even said it was closer to 3 or 2.5, something like that. And so if you think about, doubling your business over the space of 3 years, I'd say that's pretty good, right? That is a pretty good business. That's a pretty good business performance. But in terms of having this bubble in between, it doesn't really feel like that. And I started thinking about sort of an analogy for this would be to be in a kind of group of high school friends, a group of geeks, let's call them the event tech geeks, that are plugging away, doing their own thing, not very popular, not as a large part of the industry as, let's say, destinations or hotels. When you compare at a big kind of global show like IMEX, event tech is usually a small part of that, 5 to 10%. I don't know the exact numbers. So the analogy for me would be to be the group of geeks at high school. And then suddenly this group of geeks during the pandemic became incredibly popular, and they were, most popular group in the class, and that just became the center of attention. And for some reason, and in this case, of course, the pandemic, that attention went away. And fortunately, we're back to in-person events. Of course, we'll see how that develops, and hopefully we won't go back into lockdowns, etc. But most of the world is still meeting in person. And so the analogy is that this group of geeks is back to being a group of geeks, but I think they've learned a lot about it. They've learned a lot about business. They've learned about the industry. And, sadly, some have left and some have pivoted and some have merged and things have changed. But they're back to being kind of their group. And I think that was pretty good to see. And it has a lot of positive elements to it as well. And one of the things that I think a lot of the more tech-focused people can understand, and I am not a developer by any means, but I can understand enough to realize that before the pandemic, most event tech was built in very specific ways. Like each company approached the problem in a very specific way, had a specific set of tools in the back end, and that worked well for developing a single product that had its own focus. But when it came to hiring people, when it came to integrating with other technologies and other platforms, it's quite hard, or it was quite hard. And with the pandemic and this kind of rapid acceleration of especially virtual event tech, companies needed to develop things very fast. So they needed to use ways of programming and skills that were widely available. So when they brought people in, they had to shift, and I don't know the exact details, but shift to programming and developing in many very much the same way as other tech does. And that, I think, will have a really interesting lasting impact on how event tech develops, because we've seen recently layoffs at Twitter, which I think could be a whole other episode, but Facebook, a lot of the big tech companies are sadly laying off people, which is obviously never good. But there's a lot of very smart developers, programmers out there that could be incorporated in a lot of these event tech companies. And I think that rapid development because of the pandemic has changed things a little bit, and that sort of tech stack behind the scenes is now much more compatible with other tech stacks, and I think that's really good news. So I expect some really, at least the speed of development that companies have, I think has really changed now, and I think that's good news across the board. So that was my first kind of feeling about the show. Just to give you some numbers, the organizers said that there was about 6,500 people registered, or over 6,500. That includes people that registered just to participate online, because there was an online component. It was hybrid in some ways. The show, they didn't advertise it as hybrid, but it did have a virtual day the day before, and that was Tuesday the 15th. And then there was 2 on-site days on the 16th and 17th. And the organizers also confirmed that there was about 1,500 at the end of day 1 that came through the door. I don't know if day 2 was as successful, but if you're thinking maybe a couple of thousand, maybe 2,500 came through the show over the course of the 2 days. That's a significant number. This is not an IMEX that has maybe 12,000 people, something like that. This is definitely a smaller show, but it is bigger than any of the tech sectors at IMEX or IBTM World or any of the other shows. So if you're focused on event tech, particularly if you're London, UK, and even European based, I think it is a valuable way to look at what is out there in terms of event tech. So just to go through a little bit of who was there, who was exhibiting, who was investing in the show. The big investors were Stova. They were sort of the main sponsor, and I was fortunate to be invited to join Stova on stage. Chad Blaze, the chief revenue officer, was moderating a session. Also with myself and also Reese Morgan from JP Morgan. That was a very good session, well attended, and we discussed really the present and the future of event technology. So I think that was part of the investment of Stova in the show. So they were definitely one of the big investors in the show. Hubelo, I think, probably had the biggest floor space in terms of their booth. They had a big booth with a media kind of area with some food as well, some entertainment. So they were definitely there in force. We had Bizibo, Notified, One World Rental, which is more on the production side. They had quite a big stand. Rain Focus was there. Of course, Cvent had a big presence as well. And a couple of brands that may be less known, Unity and Nuna. Unity rebranded 3D VR live events, I believe the old name was, and Nuna, which was more of a camera action, one of those kind of booths to capture fun videos for social media. That was the main focus of Nuna's activation at the show. They were the larger booths. There was a lot of small booths as well, but they were the larger one. And just to say, I know that Event Tech Live partners with a lot of people in different ways. So the size of the booth isn't necessarily a reflection of the size of the company and how much they're investing in event tech. But it nevertheless is an interesting indication, and I think it's valuable to understand who invests and who doesn't. Of course, one big company that was absent and has been absent pretty much from every event is Hopin, after their big rounds of investment and really doing a lot in 2021 to capture the attention of the event industry at IMEX and other trade shows. They've really shifted their strategy. Unfortunately, announced another round of layoffs very recently, but they've also announced that they're really shifting their strategy and they're splitting out their products, which I think is a really interesting approach. And I think we'll definitely be talking more about that on Skift Meetings, so look out for that. But they were definitely not there. And a number of other kind of larger players, maybe they don't have a representation in Europe or in the UK as strong, so they would have opted not to be there. But notable absences: WebEx Events, they had a big stand at IMEX, but they weren't here in the UK. SpotMe, Event Mobi, people like that did not participate in this event, and for whatever reason, I don't really want to speculate, but I think it was still an interesting representation of who is investing and who is looking for business, who's actively looking for business, particularly in the UK market. Another thing I wanted to point out is how much education was happening at the show. There was 4 separate stages, varying capacities. There was also little areas for kind of roundtable conversations, but 4 separate stages. Varying capacities, I think something from around 70 or 80 people capacity in the main stage to something like 20 or 30 people, all using headphones, so to keep kind of the noise levels down. There are also speakers, but the noise levels I don't think were an issue, so I think it actually worked quite well. And what was also nice is that all the sessions on these stages were captured on video. We saw, I believe, the One World Rental team. I could be wrong about who was actually managing that, but we saw them do a sort of live mix of cameras and potentially slides where there were slides for the video. So I expect those to be released pretty quickly, and a lot of interesting content there. I think that approach is really interesting. Obviously not cheap. There are some costs around capturing that, but if you're going to go to the trouble of putting on a lot of education, then I think it's a really valid way of doing that. I don't believe there was live streaming of these sessions, but I think they will be mixed and sort of uploaded pretty quickly. So I think that's a really interesting approach. But just to comment around how much, these education areas, these stages took up probably something like 20 or 30% of the total floor space. So that is a huge investment in education, and it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know if it would be possible to do something like this at one of the larger trade shows. It probably doesn't make that much sense, but in this case, it makes sense because event tech, particularly new technologies or complex themes like data or ROI or even marketing approaches and or demoing some sort of new capabilities. It's great to be able to do that with technology and with education. So I think tech and education and live presentations go hand in hand. I saw some of the sessions, there wasn't a lot of sales pitches. Some were labeled as demos, which I think is perfectly fine, but for the most part they were very educational and they were well delivered. So I think it's really interesting how much education is part of the whole event tech scene, at least in this show, and so I think there is a very good relationship there between kind of education and event tech. One conversation that I kept on having at the show was developing different ways of approaching event tech. And this isn't something new, but I think it's something that's developed even more since the pandemic. And what I mean by that is the different ways of kind of dissecting and cross-secting and looking really at the event tech industry, in particular, who is buying event tech within companies. And of course, this changes depending on if you look at it from a corporate perspective, from an association perspective. And I guess the big question is, are the event planners the ones buying event technology? I mean, they're definitely part of the decision. Are they the decision makers? Probably not. There's probably some sort of procurement process. But how much are they involved? And I think through the pandemic and now, there are many situations where it's more the marketing team or marketers or head of marketing that may be more involved. There may be also situations where HR is involved in the sense of event tech to help run internal events or community building events, or even event tech that helps to manage communities, whether they be internal or external. So there's always a big question about, who are the decision makers? In many ways, this in the same way as selecting venues or destinations for events. But I think with event tech, it gets even more complicated because some companies also have big IT departments. And then, of course, there's the data and security kind of part of it. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. And what I find fascinating is that there are a number of players and companies that operate in this space or around this space that wouldn't really consider themselves as event tech. Or, we had the opportunity to speak with Mark Lair from Open Exchange. If you look at if you listen to that podcast a few weeks back, that was fascinating. Open Exchange is not a platform that I'm familiar with. I don't think they see themselves necessarily as part of the event tech group of companies, but they're a pretty large company and they definitely operate, as far as I'm concerned, in events, right? They do investor relations events, they do IPO webinars, they do all sorts of sort of banking and financially connected types of virtual events. And that's their niche, that's their business. I would say that is event tech, but it's an event tech that serves a very specific niche. So I think that's kind of interesting. The other kind of angle to that is that what drives discovery? Who's asking for different event tech or different tools or different things that they can do with event tech? Is it the planners? Is it the marketers? Is it IT from a security perspective? Is it HR? Are there other departments involved that might be looking for those things? And in particular, I think that the marketing angle is really interesting in the way that, with cookies going away and a lot of the ways that marketers have used a lot of online marketing changing quickly, social media also fluctuating always. Marketing events and the connection between marketing of events and marketing a company through events or sales, etc. Those relationships are shifting all the time. And I have a feeling, I don't have any hard data around this, but I have a feeling that marketing is more and more having conversations around how to use events, particularly to collect that first party data that's becoming so valuable and so unique to events in many ways. So that's an interesting conversation. I think it's something that's evolving. Again, it's not new, but it's definitely evolving. And we definitely discussed about that a lot at the show. So another thing I wanted to point out was this idea of the different kind of approaches to event technology. And I mentioned already some of the bigger players like Stova and Hubelo and Bizibo and Notified, also Rainfocus, Cvent, the larger kind of booths, but many other companies were present. And most of these companies, I feel, are going for this kind of all-in-one approach. They want to make sure they have all the software that's needed, particularly for corporate clients, for that enterprise model, so that they can become the platform that companies go to for all kinds of events, be they big, product launches, be they big association events in the case of associations, or small webinars, the community management side of things, but also the in-person side of things. They all want to have a strong registration part, a strong badging. They want to have a good check-in process. A lot of different elements, the lead scanning for the trade show component, or even leads at sessions, or controlling access to sessions, those kind of things. Those are all important. And if you want to be able to provide all that, I think that's really important. And so all these companies have this kind of all-in-one approach. Some use the word hybrid, some stay away from it, but essentially they want to be able to provide a really comprehensive set of products and services for anybody organizing events, particularly those that organize events on an ongoing basis. I think there's definitely a focus on this sort of more annual contract rather than a kind of one-off kind of contract. I think everybody's kind of staying away from one-offs as much as possible. Those would be more the kind of the SaaS model or the software as a service, where you have quick setups and quick turnarounds, but not necessarily a fully customized experience or anything like that. And the reason I mention this is that what then happens, particularly at trade shows, is that it's quite hard to find new ideas. It's quite hard to differentiate between the platforms because most of them will do most of the features. And I think Brant Kruger was somebody who mentioned this a while back, and I think he's right. Something like 80% of the platforms will have 80% of the features. So when you're looking for a specific feature, most of the larger players will have features, something like chat, polling, registration, whatever it is. Some will do those things better than others, but essentially they all have all the features to some extent, most of the features. So I think trade shows like this and hopefully Skift Meetings as well is helpful in that respect, are great resources to find new ideas, because I think those new ideas always come from the smaller players, from the startups, from the people who either take a different approach to the issue or the problem or whatever the platform is trying to do, or just new ideas, new types of technology. And so I wanted to highlight a few of these that I think I saw that more the themes that I saw coming up, but I think they're worth exploring. And I think for a particular type of clients, I think especially if you're trying to impress or change some sort of behavior, I think trying something that's not standardized is probably a really, really good way to go. So I had a chat with Rocco Harrow from Kickback Space, one of the platforms that's metaverse-like or 3D VR. And they do one type of approach, which is a kind of 3D environment, and then you have a sort of video square or kind of a live video feed that's kind of floating and overlaid on that space. And he has good reasons why he thinks that is the best approach, and that works well. It's quite immersive, but at the same time, you don't have to create an avatar and lose that video feed, which in many ways makes sense to connect directly with that video feed. So I think that's one approach. But I bring this up because Rocco on his booth had a whole kind of diagram of different approaches to the different really approaches to virtual events, from the basic kind of webinar camera to the avatar-based 3D model, also the kind of spatial overhead view where you can move around and kind of find each other a little bit like you can do in 3D spaces, but not a 3D space. And he kind of displayed all the different solutions and kind of made an argument of why the solution that platform, the Kickback Space, has opted for is the right one. And I thought that was a really nice way to do it. Again, going back to that education and technology connection. So I thought that was really, really, a nice way to educate people. And not everybody will agree, but at least they'll see the different options and kind of see what decisions have to be made there. Another thing that has come through in a number of different platforms on site was this idea of using AI or technology, or using more newer tools to edit content. So video recorded content. There was a couple of platforms that had AI capabilities to summarize video content, which which I think is something that a lot of planners can really relate to. That idea that if you capture a lot of content, not all of it is useful or very nice to watch online. So if you can capture that, summarize it, sometimes very short summaries to use on social media can be really useful and really powerful. Sometimes a longer summary, but still a valid summary of a session is really interesting. And so there are now tools in development, some in kind of more beta mode, but some are quite advanced, to do that editing or help you do that editing. And so that was a theme that came up quite a bit. And I met with a few different companies taking different approaches. Some very AI driven, where kind of the summary is made for you, and they're trying to improve that model as they go. And others that are taking very much more of a kind of manual approach, but still making it fast and easy to do so. So I think there's going to be a lot of developments in that space, and it's not a space that's exclusive to events, but it's definitely a space that makes a lot of sense to events, particularly when you want to go from live event to content on demand. I think it's super valuable. Another area that a few different companies were approaching was this idea of personalization. This is something that the larger event tech companies are working on, but I was interested to see that there's also some other players looking at AI again to really work on this personalization and offer a kind of layer of personalization that can be added to other platforms. And I thought that was particularly interesting. So definitely an area to watch out for, see what happens there. There was another startup that I met with looking at motivating people in terms of that kind of gamification. But I thought what was really interesting about the approach of this company was the promoting of a sort of loyalty, a sense of loyalty, a kind of loyalty scheme. So the idea being that if you take certain actions at an event, you are on a leaderboard. There's that sort of visual incentive to see how many points you can get. But it's not just a meaningless kind of list of points or number. Then you can use those points to trade for other things. And I thought that was a really interesting approach and something new that I hadn't seen before. So that's also an interesting development. Big winners of the Event Tech Awards that are also connected to the show was a company called Access Loop. And I thought that was really well deserved. They are really trying to focus on the issue of accessibility, particularly people with hearing difficulties and other accessibility issues, and for kind of having solutions for virtual event platforms and also for live events. And so I thought it was really interesting that they came up. They won, I think, 4 awards from a total of 37, but 4 big awards, and definitely, I think, a message to the industry that there's a need to make sure that accessibility is part of any event tech stack, any kind of thinking around events. I think that's super important. So congratulations to them, and I think we'll hopefully see more of that happening as well. And I think the last thing I'd mention is this idea of ROI and trying to figure out how to measure data at events. I spoke to a company that monitors, that uses cameras to monitor traffic at trade shows. So really their clients are the big people exhibiting at trade shows. And so using cameras, anonymized, so not taking any kind of video, but just using cameras to capture how many people are around the booth and what are they looking at. And I thought that was kind of interesting because it's a very safe approach. You're not capturing any sensitive data. So in terms of GDPR and other data privacy issues, there's no real issue there. And particularly when using this kind of technology at medical meetings and other kind of sectors that are highly regulated, this is something that comes up a lot, that there's a lot of restrictions. But in this case, this is, according to the vendor, very much safe for any of those environments. And if you're a pharmaceutical company spending millions on booths and figuring out what's really working, what's attracting people's attention, this could be a really interesting solution. And so there's a lot of kind of technology and better camera equipment, better sensors that are interesting in kind of trying to add that data level. And in many ways, this is that attempt at bringing the level of data capture that you have from virtual events to in-person events. I think a lot of vendors have been talking about this for a while. And it's not easy. I think Bizzabo were one of the few companies that have invested in something like this, and they were on site also talking about the Click or the reinvention of Click, which is a company that they acquired about a year ago, a smart badging company, and how that really kind of connects the dots for the in-person side of events. So I think that's what I'll mention. There was very interesting to see, and congratulations to Eventech Live on putting together a good show, and also including a lot of startups. I think that's really important. It's not always easy to find people that are working in this space. Some may be working in the space and are not that knowledgeable about the whole industry, so it's not always easy to find them. But I think congratulations to the team for finding them and working with accelerators and other people that can kind of help locate those startups and showcasing them at the show. So I think that's really, really good. And the last thing I'll mention is that there was a lot of rumors of mergers, acquisitions, layoffs around the show. I didn't speak to anybody who wanted to be on record talking about anything, but it's definitely an industry in flux, a sector in flux. Unfortunately, there are some sad stories. There are some people doing some good deals, and so looking forward to sharing some of that news when I have confirmation, when I have announcements, and when I can really speak to people more about what that means and how they're seeing the future of the industry. So I hope you enjoy this little summary. I have a lot more to talk about and a lot more to write about, so look out for more content on Skift Meetings. And hopefully you found that useful, and hopefully you also enjoyed this format. This is the first podcast that I do solo, and if you listen to any of the other Event Manager podcast episodes, you'll see that they always have a guest. This one, I am the guest and the host at the same time. So hopefully you found that useful. You didn't find my voice too monotonous, and I enjoyed giving everybody a little summary of my feelings around Eventech based on participating at Eventech Live. So I hope you enjoy that, and make sure you listen to some of the other podcast episodes. I think you'll enjoy those as well, and see you next time.